That's about as good as you're gonna see.
Right. There we go. Just get too close to that now. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Washington County Heritage Center. We are so excited to have you here and for George Schire to give us part 2 of Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling. So thank you all for showing up. We appreciate it. My name is Emily Krachewski. I am the site manager of the Heritage Center. We are open Tuesday through Sunday. Only day we're closed is Monday. 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. are our hours. Brent Peterson is back there as well. He is the executive director of the Historical Society. And I just want to do a quick little intro for George here, and then I'm going to fix the microphone again. An avid historian, George Schire has been a writer and columnist for national wrestling publications and a ring announcer. His work aims to not only set the record straight, but to entice you into a world gone by, a world that comes alive through his colorful and perceptive reporting. George lives in Oakdale, Minnesota, and has a wrestling room, and also brought some of his paraphernalia tonight. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to George. And welcome tonight.
I didn't give her any notes, so sounds pretty good. I almost want to meet me. First of all, thank you, each and every one of you, for coming out, taking time out of a nice summer evening. They are limited, so I appreciate it. I'm going to do one and one only quick commercial advertisement, and then, as they say, we'll get on with the show. I have here my book, Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling. And as they say on TV, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. For those of you that have it already, thank you. Much appreciated that you do, and that's great. For those of you that don't have it, or you have an uncle, a grandma, an aunt, friend, neighbor, co-worker that you could share it with, they are for sale tonight, but here's the deal. The book is, if you look at the back cover, it's $29.95. And I always tell people, if you go down to Barnes & Noble and buy it, it's going to cost you about $32 after you give Uncle Sam his tax. So $30, let's just round it. I have them on sale in the back for $25. Now here's the deal. If you buy a book tonight, the entire purchase price goes to the Washington County Heritage Center as a donation, 100% of it. So I think it's a good way to thank Emily, Brent, and all the staff for all that they do here on a regular basis, bringing in people, sharing the history of Washington County. And this is a way that, small way you can support it. And also becoming a member down the road, if you choose to, of the Washington County Historical Society. So there you have it, $25, you made a donation, okay? I told you that's the only advertisement, and I promise. All right. Oh boy, I had a couple of you up here looking at the posters. And behind me, there is this ring loaded with people, as you can see. And this was very typical of the day before we got into what is today called sports entertainment wrestling. Because this wrestling, well, let me ask you a question. I heard a couple of you mumbling my words up there earlier. Was it real? Anybody?
Yes.
Was it fake?
Yes.
Or was it something else?
Scripted.
Peanut gallery?
Predetermined.
All right. Well, here's the deal, gang. It was real. It wasn't fake. And I say that because the wrestlers hate that word so bad. And some of you that were here last time, you know that I would tell you stories about the broken down wrestlers when you meet them, Nick Bockwinkel and Mad Dog Vachon and the Crusher and Vern Gagne and Jim Brunzell and the Baron von Raschke, how they're crippled up. They've had hip replacements, knee replacements, shoulder replacements. elbow replacements and surgeries and ankles that are fused. And of course, these guys are this way when they're 60, 70, 80, and so on. And so many of them have passed away now. But they're that way because they were doing something that was fake. And that's where the story comes in. Yes, it was predetermined. The result of every single match. They knew the endings. But really what went on inside the ring, the wrestlers worked it out themselves. They knew what they had to do to get to the finish. And we all know when we watch our favorite TV shows, we know that the Western you're watching or the drama you're watching or the detective show you're watching, we know that it's not real. You know, John Wayne didn't get killed. Cary Grant didn't get killed. None of these people, they died in their movies. And at the end of the movie, they got up and went home and they were happy that you bought a ticket to see the movie. So pro wrestling, the best way to describe it is that it was a real life soap opera. And their main objective every single night of the week, back in the day when they would go out and wrestle, a wrestler would go out and wrestle 300, 350 nights a year. And I'm serious on that, traveling from town to town to town to town. Many of them back in the era when we didn't have air flight or the ability to travel or the promoters to pay them to travel. And so they'd have to hop into, as some of them have described, we'd hop into the back of a big old 98 Oldsmobile, 6 of us, 8 of us, if we could fit them in and chip in on gas and head to the next town 300, 400, 500, 600 miles away. And they would do this on a daily, nightly basis. And they might be in Des Moines, Iowa one night. They might be in Chicago, Illinois the next night. The next night they're up in Winnipeg. Then they might have to drive to Omaha, Nebraska. There was never any rhyme or reason as to how nobody put out a road map. Well, let's make it simple, you know, go point A, point B. No, they didn't do that. You were here, you were over here, you were down here, up here, back here. And that's the way it went. And in order to do that, 300, and I'm also going to add that there are only 365 days in any given year. I think we all know that. But there were wrestlers that wrestled as many times as 365, 70, and 80 times, 380 times a year. And if you say, well, how in the world would they do that with it's only 365? Well, fact is, sometimes they'd work 2 cards. One in one city, they might work the opening match or the second match, third match on the card, finish it, get in their car, and travel 200 miles, 300 miles to get to the town in the evening to do another card. And so when you get all said and done, they had this grueling schedule. The other thing that was very important to remember when we use that word fake, they were all 100% independent contractors, meaning that they didn't have contracts with a specific promoter or promotion. They worked out a personal deal. I will come in and work for you for X number of dates. You're promised a certain amount of money, and that's the way the contract worked. They'd shake hands, pre-COVID, how I'd bump them. But that's the way it worked. And when they were done, they went on their merry way. But because they were independent contractors, they would be paid. They were responsible for their own hotels, their own travel, a lot of and of course, their own medical. They had no medical insurance. And so the sad part is that if, and it did happen, guys, when they were hurt, most often they would wrestle with that injury as best they could. I mean, obviously, if they had a broken leg, maybe not, but broken bones, sprained wrists, sprained fingers, broken elbows. You guys heard Ray Stevens? You've heard of Ray Stevens? Ray the Crippler Stevens, he wrestled with a broken elbow for almost 6 months one time. Literally broken elbow. And they would tape them up, tape their ankles, and they'd go in and do their job. Because if they didn't wrestle, make the card for the promoter and get their pay, obviously they don't eat, they don't feed their families, and they'll probably never wrestle again for that promoter if they no-show. So it was really imperative. And the other thing that was important about them making a particular card and working for a promoter was that they didn't want to lose their spot in the promotion. These guys were like any other major league sport. The more reliable you can be, the better you are at what you did, the higher up you were on the card, the more dependable you were. And if you could draw people, you were a promoter's dream. And so they didn't want to lose that spot. So they were there by hook or crook. So was it fate? Yeah, it was. They protected each other inside the ring. They would go in and make sure that they talked to each other, little cute words during the course of the match. You never saw it as a fan. Maybe once in a while you might see something, but for the most part, they had signals, things they did, and they made their moves, they did their match. And then when it got time to 25, 30 minutes into the card, they would say, one of them would say, take it home. Or they would just say home. And that means we're going to end the match. However, the promoter and the storyline that they were building to in the soap opera was supposed to end. And the key thing to remember is, just like your favorite soap opera, or even your movies or your sequels and different things, whatever they do in these shows, they do them to make you want to tune in next week. They make you want to come back and see the show again. Can't miss, gotta watch Thursday night. Oh my goodness, way back when, who killed JR? Who shot JR? They had to. And all your daily soap operas. And that's what professional wrestling is. The big matches on a card are all about a story. And promoters generally will go 6 months down the road. So here we are in August right now. We go up to February of 2023. And that's where the promoters are starting at with two guys or a tag team, two tag teams, where they want them to end up. And so they're going to go back now for the next 4, 5, 6 months, and they are going to tell the story each time in a different way in the match to make you want to keep coming back. Usually the good guy in the beginning of the feud gets the crap kicked out of him, has outside interference from an opponent's tag team partner, or gets hit by the proverbial foreign object. And the referee didn't see it, and he lost, or he was injured for a little bit. And all those things are to make you as the fan understand that he didn't get treated fairly. He got ripped off. That bad guy, that Mad Dog, or whoever it was in the ring, did something he shouldn't have done, and you want to go back next week or next month and see your hero. The heroes were called baby faces, for those of you that don't know. And so the baby faces would then have to get revenge. Well, naturally, you're going to go to part 2 of the series, and this time he might get miffed again because he didn't win. And so you keep it going. And whatever the storyline is, then finally we get to that point where we're up to February, and it's time what the promoters would call the blow-off match. The blow-off match was this is the end of the feud. And they would advertise it as, this is it, fans. End of the line, there's going to be a winner. We put up a 6-foot steel cage. Both wrestlers will be locked in. No winner until there's no one out till there's a winner. And as a fan, you're expecting this is it. Mad Dog versus the Crusher. I heard somebody talking about it earlier. Mad Dog versus the Crusher inside the steel cage. Oh my God, this is it. Will one of them survive? And that's usually the night that the Crusher, how about that? The Crusher would come out the winner. He gets his revenge. And then they move on to something else. And they got already other things in the bucket, so to speak, to get you to keep coming back. And that was Vern Gagne's famous comment many years ago. He said, our job on television, on All-Star Wrestling, he says, our job is to give you this teaser, and then we got to get you to the arena. And once we get you in the auditorium, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and that's all we're talking about tonight, but one of those arenas, they had to give you a reason once you were there to come back next week or month. Now, specifically because we're here we talk about the AWA, the American Wrestling Alliance, which it was in the beginning, later became American Wrestling Association. They never told us why or how, it just happened. Vern Gagne later on said, well, it always was Alliance. So, well, it wasn't Vern, but okay. But it was American Wrestling Alliance. And Vern Gagne, he was the man behind the scenes. He was, and everybody here knows who Vern Gagne was, right? He was a legitimate amateur wrestler who took it very, very seriously. He graduated from the University of Minnesota, so naturally he was a hometown boy. And back in 1948, he was an alternate on the 1948 Olympics. Coincidentally enough, and we'll touch on that in a minute, but coincidentally enough, another man was on the 1948 Olympics by the name of Maurice Vachon. And he and Vern Gagne met each other there. Mad Dog was also a great amateur wrestler. But Vern Gagne represented the Olympics. Amateur wrestling, he went in after he got out of the Olympics, he was going to go play football. He had a contract with the Chicago Bears. He had an opportunity to go. And in those days, and we're talking 1948, 49, right in that range, football would pay you about $5,000 a year. They didn't have the lucrative contracts that all major league stars, athletes have today. Much bigger by any standard than what was back then. And Vern decided that with his wrestling background, his amateur background, that he could get into pro wrestling. He was encouraged by a guy named, he's on the bottom poster over there on the left, a guy by the name of Joe Pazendak. I was talking to someone earlier. Joe Pazendak was what they called a shooter in pro wrestling, which means he was the real deal. A shooter was a guy who, yeah, it was fake. But when you get in the ring with Joe Pazendak or Billy Robinson, there's a more modern name. I could throw even a more modern name out like Kurt Angle. Okay, but these guys were legit shooters, meaning that you go into the ring with them and you follow the so-called script, how you're supposed to do things. But if you didn't, and you thought you were going to get cute and you're going to test him, well, Joe Pazendak would break your fingers off, hand them to you before you knew he took them off. It was that quick. Or he'd break your wrist. Now, they didn't do stuff like this on purpose, but it did happen when you get somebody that would try to test you a little bit. And Vern Gagne was as close to a shooter as you could come to on the American wrestling scene. And meaning that Vern was the real deal. And so when he got into the professional side of professional wrestling, he always wanted the sport, as they called it, to be recognized as legitimate, as real. And so if you attended any of Vern Gagne's or the AWA's cards throughout the decades, usually you were seeing some doggone good matches with some really good workers. Vern always insisted on wrestling first and gimmick later. Now you notice I'm wearing this A jacket, and I'll turn around and it's got the big A on the back. I only wore this for two purposes. One, because back in Vern Gagne's early era, most wrestlers, because they couldn't wrestle on the mat, professional or amateur type wrestling, they needed a gimmick. And the gimmicks could sometimes be the result of a costume, or it could be the result of something, dyeing their hair, bleaching it blonde, putting curlers in it, wearing a long fancy robe, strutting through the ring, through the audience, throwing bobby pins to the lady fans, insulting the fans. We've got a couple right here. Going up to the lady and saying, "You can do much better than that big fat old man sitting next to you." But it was all to get attention. And they couldn't wrestle. I'm speaking, of course, about Gorgeous George. Gorgeous George was a journeyman wrestler for many years by the name of George Wagner. And he was in the lower matches on the card, wasn't making much money, very mundane, had no charisma about him. And believe it or not, he got that idea to do the bleach blonde hair. Now, when you go back to the 40s, I mean, we got a lot of weird things out there today. But when you go back to the 40s and you got this guy who's got the bleach blonde, curly long hair with the feminine robes and strutting and handing out Georgie pins, spraying the ring so that he doesn't get germs on it. You know, this guy was really over the top. But he made money. And the promoters, man, they wanted this guy. If you could get Gorgeous George on your card, on your wrestling card, it was a bona fide sellout. And then you put a guy like a Vern Gagne against Gorgeous George, you automatically have this question about who's gonna win. Can scientific Vern, all-American, mom's apple pie, good guy beat this pompous, arrogant, egotistical blowhard? And that's what brought the fans in. And Gorgeous George was an extremely good talent and made a lot of money. He never stayed in the territory. He was what they called back in the day an attraction. So a promoter in a territory could only get him for 1 or 2, maybe 3 shows, and maybe not even consecutive shows. Sometimes they'd have to bring him back later on. Sort of bouncing ahead with that attraction thing. How many of you have heard of Andre the Giant? Just about everybody. And Andre the Giant was a legit, well, he was as tall as my friend Craig back there, 7 foot tall, 7 foot tall. He was 7'4", and he weighed about 450 pounds, and this was when he was 17 years old. He got some wrestling training, but he really wasn't a wrestler, but he was just a behemoth, big, and he drew money because of that ability, you know, to be so big, and who could beat this guy? And so he was an attraction, and he never stayed in any territory either. And he would go from territory to territory to territory and make a lot of money doing it. So there were a lot of wrestlers that did that. But a lot of promotions had what we call them mainstays. And I know it's a little bit hard to see there, but you're welcome later on to go up and look if you haven't. These on this poster are 63 of the top AWA wrestlers from 1960 to 1990. And I say the top 63 because back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, wrestlers traveled, as I said, 350 days a year around the country. But they would go into a territory and they would agree to work for maybe 6 months, a year, 2 years, and then they would move on because they didn't want to get stale. They didn't want their gimmick or their drawing power to get stale. And the promotion itself would insist on that. But the mainstays, and in the top row on that poster, we have Vern Gagne, the Crusher, Larry Hennig, Mad Dog Vachon, Dr. X, Bill Watts, Blackjack Lanza, Bobby Heenan, Nick Bockwinkel. Those are the first group of guys at the top. And they were the AWA mainstays. If you looked at all the programs throughout the years, any wrestler who came into the territory eventually had to meet up with one of those guys. And it was, you guys all remember the Crusher? The Crusher, biggest, one of the greatest characters ever. And he was such an over-the-top baby face that any bad guy that came to town, eventually that bad guy was going to have to face the Crusher. The Crusher was the one that was going to deliver the justice after everyone else had failed. And that was the whole objective. You know, this guy would be beat by the bad, you know, the bad guy would beat this guy and this guy and this guy. He'd injure this one and injure that one. Oh my God, what are we going to do? You know, this guy's running roughshod. So eventually they'd somehow get him involved with the Crusher. The Crusher would come out on All-Star Wrestling, you know, hey, how about that? And he'd have his beer and, you know, the Crusher was quite the character. So he'd have battles with Mad Dog and Nick Bockwinkel, who he would come out and call him Hoodwinkle, Jerkwinkle on his interviews, you know, and he would wrestle against Bobby Heenan. He gave Bobby Heenan the name Weasel. And originally Bobby Heenan would come out. Originally Bobby was Pretty Boy, Bobby Heenan, in his early days. And he had his blonde hair and he'd have jackets on, you know, very similar to this. He was kind of arrogant and pompous. Well, then he went from Pretty Boy to the Brain, because he was taking care of managing wrestlers because he had a brain and he was going to guide them to the championship. Well, as his bad guys are beating up all the good guys to get to the championship, the Crusher finally ended up being one of those challengers. And on one TV interview, the Crusher, because as he got older, and this is a fact, back the truck up a little bit, beep, beep, beep. The Crusher, when he first started out in the AWA, he was for the first 3 years, he was the most hated wrestler the AWA had. And he was still younger. This was in the very early 60s. And he was Crusher Lisowski in those days. And he was just believable in the ring with the way he was such a brute. He'd go in and pound people. And in those days, he put on, for his finishing hold, you guys all know what the full Nelson is. Well, he'd put a full Nelson on his opponent, and the guy's head would be getting closer to his belly. And he'd keep putting the pressure on. And his fingers would be in the guy's neck. And the guy's passed out. His opponent's passed out. And the referee's counting, Crusher, he's done. Give up, you're done. And the Crusher would, my fingers are all swelled up. I can't release them, you know. And of course, then eventually he'd get disqualified or something. And then he used the stomach claw. He'd get his opponent down and he'd put his claws into their tummy. And he wouldn't break that either. And he'd say his fingers swelled up. But the interesting thing is that after you get done, you could see his fingerprints in the wrestler's belly. I mean, they did do that real, but probably just pressure. But Crusher was really over as a heel. Well, wrestling was kind of cyclical in the sense that if you had a great bad guy and he's in the territory long enough, and Crusher was a local wrestler, he lived in Milwaukee. Most of his career, he wrestled around the Midwest. He did have some work out east, did wrestle down south for a little bit in his heel days, but basically a Midwest wrestler. And so when he got to the point where, you know what, we can come up with a great storyline if we can turn him, make him a baby face. And they came up with a storyline. Well, once they did that, there was no one on the AWA scene from 1965 right up till the very end that could put more butts in those seats than the Crusher. And this is a true fact. Vern Gagne, he was the owner, he was the real deal, he was the promoter. Most people didn't know that back in the 60s and 70s, that behind the scenes, he really was the promoter, even though Wally Carbo would come out, stammer and stutter and levy fines and suspensions to all the bad guys. But it was Vern Gagne that was the behind the scenes guy. But he was extremely, and I can't overemphasize this, he was extremely popular. And when Vern Gagne would be on a marquee as a coming to a card, and this started back as early as 1950 when he was just starting out in the business. When he was on the card, because of his amateur background, because of his aerial skills and the different things that he could do in the ring, he drew really well. And the marquee with his name on it always drew extra people. However, when the Crusher became a good guy, the Crusher actually could outdraw Vern. And behind the scenes, it didn't always set well with Vern. You know, like, I'm the guy here. He had an ego. And when you're a business person and when you're an athlete, you have to have an ego. It doesn't matter. You have to succeed. You're a baseball player, football player, it doesn't matter. You have to have an ego. You have to believe that you're better than you are and you can be better than you want to be. So Vern had an ego, and it bothered him that the Crusher could outdraw him and would sometimes get more cheers than him. And so every once in a while, the Crusher would be injured. A lot of times Crusher just took a self-imposed vacation because he worked here and he did this, and sometimes he just wanted to take a month or 2 or 3 off, and he did. But what would happen is that when he would leave, well, Vern's attendance would drop a little bit. No matter who he was putting in that babyface role in the main event, up to and sometimes including himself, they weren't drawing as well. So Vern would get on the phone and, Reggie Lisshouse, Reggie, Crush, you gotta come back. And Crusher would always come back on his own terms. Yeah, I'll do it for this time, that time frame, or whatever you want. And Vern would bring him back, and man, they would have the pop. The fans would pop. Oh my God. Sometimes he'd be a surprise tag team partner for someone. Or sometimes he'd just show up into the ring area. I'm gonna let you guys look this one up when you go home. You go to YouTube and you look up the Crusher versus Mad Dog Vachon. And it is a YouTube video. And it's from 1970 in January. And the Crusher had been injured since August of '69 by the Vachon brothers, Mad Dog and his little brother, Butcher. Butcher was 45 pounds heavier and about 4 feet taller than the dog, but Mad Dog called him his little brother. Well, Crusher was injured in a Chicago match in August of �69. And you know, fans, the Crusher's out of action. We don't know when he's going to return. We do know that he wants to get back at the dog. And they leave it at that. The Vachon brothers won the tag team title that night that they injured the Crusher. Crusher's back was injured. And you know, some fans, we've been told he may never wrestle again. Keep that interest going. So January of '70, we move ahead 5 months. In the TV studio, Mad Dog and his little brother, the Butcher, they're wrestling against Edouard Carpentier. Anybody remember that name? The Flying Frenchman. He was good. He was good. And he had a mediocre partner for the TV match named Bruce Kirk. The Vachons were at their evil best or worst that night. And they injured poor Bruce Kirk. I mean, he couldn't continue for the second fall. And now poor Edouard Carpentier, he is going to have to go in there by himself. Well, you know, that wasn't going to go very well because now there's 2-on-1, and you know, the Vachons, they weren't really known to keep the rules. So they're double teaming them. Well, wouldn't you know, out from behind the curtain, ring is here, out from behind the curtain, after being gone for 4 months, bang! Pops the crowd in the audience. It's the Crusher in his sport coat, and he's pointing to the dog, you know, because he hated the dog. And he got into the ring, tried to stay in order. Well, the dog, the Butcher, they double teamed him. They ripped off his shirt. Butcher, Mad Dog was on the apron, got his head busted open. Now, here's why I want you to look that match up. I'm going to stop right there. When you look it up on YouTube, you're going to see Mad Dog fall out of the ring, and he's going to hit the ringside table that's right at ringside in the TV studio. And when he does, he hits his head, he goes down to the floor. Now, when he's going down to the floor, and I know this is going to really spoil it for you. Most of the time when these guys were cut, they did it themselves. So Mad Dog going down from Crusher's punch, hits his head on the table, goes to the floor, and he's doing this little razor blade thing so that when he comes up, he's bloody. Well, what happened was, this was when the script went awry. Crusher came down and stomped on his head on the floor, and when he was doing it, the dog actually hit an artery. And this is true. I want you to watch this video. You'll see the dog come up, and it's on TV. The Crusher is then choking Mad Dog. And the dog has literally the blood squirting out of his head. And the announcer, Roger Kent, that's an old name you may remember, Roger Kent goes off script. And he goes, oh my God, this is not real here. Mad Dog is really hurt. We've got to get in and get some pressure on that head. Butcher's trying to get it on. The Crusher wasn't yet aware of what had happened. But the bottom line was, that was a time when yes, he was supposed to get bloody, but no, it wasn't supposed to happen the way it was. And true story, that night in January, it was around January 17th. I don't know how to remember dates like that. I can't remember anything else. But he was scheduled to wrestle that night, the Mad Dog was. And he was legitimately over in whatever the big hospital is in Minneapolis. You guys would know what it is. HCMC. I think it had maybe a different name at the time, but it was the big hospital. Hennepin County, thank you. See, I had a plant here. So he was legitimately in the hospital. He had received umpteen stitches. He was legitimately hurt that night. So they had to revise the card, so to speak, on the come that night because Mad Dog was in their main event and he wasn't able to wrestle. So those are things that sometimes when you talk about fake, yeah, it was, and many times things went bad. And there were times when wrestlers would get injured and they'd have to stop a match, or one of the wrestlers would signal another one, hey, gotta take it home, whatever, and they would take care of each other and do it, tell their story another day. The reason I have this behind me is I know every one of you that one day I'm not gonna get to that damn thing. That is, back in the day, a typical arena. And I pointed out because if any of you, and I hope if you do watch today's modern day product, Brent, would you have them escorted out? I'm teasing. Today's product is known as sports entertainment. And they admit up front that it is just entertainment and nothing is real. So I guess they've shown us that the rabbit really does come out of the hat. But here's a picture from a typical black and white era. Now you'll notice they have the ring steps here. You notice how close the ringside seats are to the ring. The announcer's table is right here, the TV announcer or ring announcer. A lot of times they would move that right up to right here. But in this case, it's here. And the wrestlers, you see the aisles, and of course, fans to the rafters. And here's another table on the other side. Sometimes they would move out to multiple TV for matches. But the difference between the sports entertainment today and this picture, for example, is back in the 60s when I was a kid, and I'd go up to ringside if I wanted to. And you know, funny thing is, I never did this except once. But you could go up to the ring because there were no barriers. You just had the and I will tell you, this was the cement floor of the arena. If you watch WWE today, and again, if you do, you gotta leave. But they have mats on the floor. They have the barricades around so the fans can't get in there. But back in this era, when the good guy would come out for his match, the announcer would introduce him, and he'd come into the ring, and he would stand in the corner, and he would invite the kids or the fans to come up and sign autographs. And he'd sign their name on the program they had for the night, or their piece of paper they brought, or their lunch, lunch basket, whatever it was. And there used to be a lot of them there. Now, the reason I said I only did it once, I was 10 years old, and my dad had taken me to the matches. And I wasn't 10, I was 14. Get it right, Shire. And if I get dates wrong, my wife's gonna be on. I was 14 years old, my dad had to take me, and my dad wasn't a fan. If he took me to the matches, it was because he was trying to be a good dad, and I would go. And usually I had to beg him to get to him. Before that time, I didn't have a license, so I had to just wait till dad was ready to go. This particular card right here, it's Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher against Pretty Boy Larry Hennig and Handsome Harley Race. And I was standing on the ring apron that night getting an autograph. And the reason this is so memorable to me is that some of you might be old enough to remember that back in the 60s, at around 12 o'clock on a Saturday night on Channel 4, there was a show called The Bedtime News with Dave Moore. And it was news, N-O-O-Z. And Dave Moore would do kind of a comical type newscast, But he would always include the wrestling results. He was one of the few guys back then would give you the name or the results to the card. Well, on this particular night, my neighbors were telling me that I was on TV because they had shown a clip and I was actually in the picture that they showed of getting an autograph. And I think I was getting the autograph of Eddie Sharkey. And I normally didn't get autographs. I always just figured it only shows they know how to write. So, shows you what I know, because if I had a lot of those autographs today, you know, they might be worth something. But that said, I do have a ton of autographs of guys like Vern Gagne, the Crusher, and even Mad Dog Vachon. And so, with that, I will take a quick break, and I will ask you, and then I've got plenty more, but I will ask you, is there anything in particular that anyone has thought of they want to ask me before we go on? And if not, I'll keep it up. Yes.
Okay, so when Vern Gagne, you said he turned his back on a Bears contract for $5,000. What could he do with wrestling?
I'm glad you asked that. Back in 1957, in a magazine, it was a Reader's Digest version of a magazine. You know, not Reader's Digest. Do you remember the TV guides in the old days? Well, this was a TV guide, but it was kind of a national version of TV guide. And they actually had a story. I have the issue. They have a story on Vern Gagne. And Vern Gagne was popular all over the country. He was one of those guys like Gorgeous George where they wanted him on their card because it meant box office. So to answer your question, in 1957, it was reported that Vern Gagne at the time was making $100,000 a year. Now, seriously, $100,000 today is still good money a year, okay? Now, he started wrestling, Vern started wrestling on May 3rd, 1949. That was his first pro match. And he would have been making a lot more than $5,000 a year with the demands that he had all over the country. And the professional wrestlers of the 50s, and again, I always tell people to keep inflation in. I have people that look at posters like that. I don't know if I have the, yeah, the ticket prices are on the bottom here. And so this card, and I want to talk about this card in a minute, but at the bottom, this is from 1957. And the ticket prices are $3, $2.25, and $1.50. So that means in an auditorium like this, you could get a ringside seat. And a ringside seat would be, you know, anywhere from here on back for $3. Well, you know, you look at that today and you go, wow, look at those prices. But you have to remember that the average household income in 1957, well, we're just talking average now. For some guy just trying to go to work every day and make money to feed his family, the average household income was about $8,000 to $10,000, if it was that, a year. So it's all in perspective. Today, you go to the same type of card and you're probably gonna have a ticket at 50, 60, 70, $100. How about some of the concerts when they're in the 150 range and that sort of thing? But we have to remember that salaries have all, you know, changed with the times. So that's what you look at. And when guys like Vern Gagne, they would walk in and they'd get a percentage of the cage right up front. There'd be a promise with the promoter. So a lot of their work, the more people they could draw, the better they were gonna do it at pay time. A lot of times they did have a guarantee for the night, so the promoter was gonna pay him whether he made the money or not. But usually it was all about, when I said earlier, but they don't wanna lose their spot on the card. That was the reason, because the more money they can make, better chances they have of coming back. I wanted to talk about this because, you know, we live in a world today where we really, I don't think I have to even tell you this, we have become, and for the better, we have become very politically correct with many things. We became conscious of so many things that were wrong in our world, the way people are treated, all kinds of things. So we don't know that. Well, this is from August 6th, 1957. And that would have made me 5, 6. Thanks. I have my official my mathematician. Now you can do the math real quick and figure out, but this guy's 102. I was 6 years old, a month away from being 6 or 7. 6. Thanks. I was a month away from turning 6. That's not important. Why are you talking about that? So anyway, the reason this card is important is because it is the official first match, first card that as a kid, I remember going to. And I still have the program for it in my files. But here's the story that was so interesting to me. This was about 7, 8 years after World War II. 8, 9 years since World War II had ended. And as a society, wrestling promotions were better at this than anybody. They would make you hate the Russians, hate the Japanese, hate the Germans, hate the Jewish, you name it. But here's where the no politically correctness comes in. On this card, the main event is, as Marty O'Neill, the great announcer, used to say, the bearded, garlic-eating Russians. And they're going against the dirty Japs. Dirty Japs. Mitsu Arakawa and Kenshi Shibuya. Okay? Now, you know, in today's world, we wouldn't use that type of terminology, but we were built around that type of sentiment. And I go with my dad. I'm 6 years old. And in the auditorium, we were somewhere back here. My dad got seats. My dad didn't like wrestling. But I'm sitting there, and I got to give this to you from a 6-year-old perspective. I get in my seat, and I'm looking around the auditorium. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, everybody in the whole world is here. And there were about 3,000 people, 4,000 people, I don't know. But I say that, and then I remind you that when you're 6 years old, that is everybody in the whole world, because at a 6-year-old level, your world is your kindergarten class and the 4 neighbors. That's it. That's the world. So I looked around and I saw all these people. And as we went through the card, in one of the preliminary matches, that guy named Vern Gagne was on the card right here. And he's wrestling a guy named Carl Stieff. I didn't know who Carl Stieff was. I recognized Vern Gagne, and my dad, though he wasn't a fan, he liked Vern. That was the appeal that he had, that even non-fans could like him. And so the fans cheered really loud when Vern was introduced. And then the surprise of surprises came for me. I had no idea what to expect in this tag team match, but it was unique because both of the tag teams, the Russians and the Japanese, they were bad guys. There were no good guys in this one. They were the hated Russians and the hated Japanese. And again, my program, I swear to you, I should have brought it. It says Dirty Japs. Headline right on the program. So I said, and now here was the revelation. At 6 years old, I looked around and I realized that the entire planet Earth is here tonight. And first come the Russians walking down the aisle. Now, with that, I'm going to stop the clock again and tell you that you see the lights above the ring? In this era, that's all that showed on the ring, those lights. The rest of the auditorium, as you see, is dark. And so you know the wrestlers are coming down the aisle, but they did not have any entrance music, any fireworks going off like you're watching today's product. And it takes them 25 minutes to walk down the aisle to the ring. No, they were coming down and you'd hear the crowd rumbling as they're coming and booing and getting louder. So I'm sitting there with this 3,000 people, and it's getting louder, the boos. And the two Russians, they climb into the ring. It says Ivan, that was correct, but for some reason back then they called him Ivan. But he later did morph into Ivan Kelmakov, but he was Ivan Kelmakov. He got into the ring, and Marty O'Neill gets into the center of the ring. Wrestling fans from Rostov, Russia, at a combined weight of 472 pounds, they are Ivan and Carol Kelmakov. Oh my God, I had to put my hands over my ears. And I'm serious, I did. My little 6-year-old ears, they booed so loud, the fans. And I couldn't believe how loud they booed. Well, then it comes time for their opponents of the evening, Kenji Shibuya and Mitsu Arakawa. And they started coming down the aisle. Oh, and let me tell you this, I want to back up to the Russians 1 second. When they got into the ring, they had long coats on, button-down coats, the big lapels, and they had the biggest hats that they were wearing, like a Russian, it must have been some type of a Russian hat. I've got pictures of them. And I remember thinking, that is the biggest hat I've ever seen in my life. You know, like, how do they move? You know, what a little kid would think of. But anyway, so here comes Mitsu and Kenji. Wrestling fans, their opponents. First from Honolulu, Hawaii, 228 pounds, Kenji Shibuya. And with that booyah, the way Marty dragged it out, I can't tell you how loud that crowd booed. And it was louder than with the Russians. And his partner, his cousin from, they pronounced it Hiroshima in those days. Hiroshima, Japan, 222 pounds, Mitsu Arakawa. Man, did they boo. I have never heard so much, and literally my ears hurt. And when I did go home that night after the matches, my ears hurt. But here was the weird thing. I said to my dad, Dad, how come they're booing? How come all of them are getting booed? You know, in the other matches, Vern Gagne was cheered when they introduced him. And Joe Passendak got booed. And Carl Steve got booed. Red Bastille got cheered. You know, we had clear definition. So I said, Dad, how come they're booing all of them? And my dad goes, I hope they all kill each other. And I'm like, I did. I know I must have looked at him. And I said, he says that. I hope they just kill each other. And of course, here was the fun of the match. As the match was going on, this is where I really learned about fans. They hated all of them, all four of them. So when Ivan Kelmakov would slug one of the Japanese, the fans went boo, or they cheer like hell. They cheer because the Japanese just got hit. But when the Japanese would hit the Russian, they cheer. So at 6 years old, I'm like really confused, you know. But like my dad said, they just wanted to kill each other. Well, here's the thing that I learned later on, and I was really too young to understand it at the time. As I mentioned earlier before about World War II. And even though Russia itself was an ally to the United States in World War II at the time, technically, it was the Germans that were our evil enemies, along with the Japanese, because of Pearl Harbor and everything. But they were foreigners. And wrestling promoters knew that if they bring an evil foreigner in, stomping, kicking, claiming they're going to take a title or they're going to injure everyone because America's weak, you know, and pull it off, that they could draw money with these. Most of the time, the wrestlers that were portraying these evil foreigners, they weren't foreigners at all. Ivan Kelmakov was a good old American boy from Detroit, Michigan by the name of Ed Bruce. But he didn't make any money as Ed Bruce for 10 years of his career, so let's grow a beard and, you know, come up with these big boots and the top hats. And come up with a brother. And Karol Kelmakov was not Russian, he was actually Polish. And I cannot pronounce his last name, but trust me, it looks like an eye chart. It's about that long. And his real name is Karol is his real name, and then the rest of that. So two guys who were not Russians, but made from 1953 until 1963, they were together the entire decade going around the country. And they were one of the hottest tag teams. Everyone wanted to stop the Russians. And they made a lot of money together. Short story, Vern Gagne was going to bring them back in 1964. He had Ivan Kelmakov already here. And he was going to bring in brother Karol. Karol had been wrestling down in the Mid-South Territory, Oklahoma, Louisiana. And after a match, Karol went to the dressing room and collapsed and died of a heart attack. And that halted the plans in 1964. So Vern did the next best thing. He decided to turn Ivan Kelmakov into a good guy. Who's gonna cheer a Russian? Well, they got to figure out a way. So they have this guy that's been sitting in the ring audience for the past 4 weeks, long trench coat on and a little flat cap, and he'd waddle over to Marty O'Neill and mumble something. Obviously it was a foreign language. Marty didn't know what he was saying. They'd escort him back. Well, this went on for a couple of weeks, and finally they asked Ivan Kelmakov if he could translate what this man was saying. So Ivan is going, a Russian, supposedly, going to translate this Polish guy. And then the Polish guy took off his jacket, he had a long trench coat, took it off. Oh my gosh, the build, muscles, seriously. And in those days, I'm here to tell you, they did not use any artificial enhancements. It turns out that he was a legitimate, before this, he was a legitimate former Mr. Michigan bodybuilder, and his name was Dick Garza. And he had been wrestling for about 6 years, again, floating around, not really making it big with just being plain old boring Dick Garza. So Vern Gagne created the mighty Igor, Polish, who wanted to learn how to become a wrestler. Well, what better way to learn to wrestle than to have Ivan Kelmakov teach him the ropes and be his partner and his mentor? So that was our new babyface team, and everybody loved Igor. Many of you remember Igor. He played a very, in that era, for lack of a better term, he played a very simple, boyish type man. And he'd hand out toys to the kids, and he'd wave to people, and he'd come out eating his kielbasa or whatever it was, Polish sausage. And he did these feats of strength, and nobody could hurt him. That was his whole gimmick, that nobody could hurt Igor because he was so strong. And they did feats of strength. They had Igor hold back he put his back against the wall and hold back a car coming at him. And he would bust cement blocks on his head. Ivan would take a sledgehammer and break the block. Now the block may have been gimmicked a little bit, I don't know. Nonetheless, it was legit, and you'd see Igor grimacing as, that block would be, but he did all these things, these feats of strength, and the fans adored him. Vern had a gold mine. And then he hooked him up with the Crusher. And what a great combination. And the Crusher, he was Polish. With a name like Lisowski, he was Polish too. So Crusher told him he was now training Igor on beer. We're gonna bring him my old man with the barrels of beer, So there you go. So now the second story on the Japanese. Mitsu Arakawa was of real Japanese descent. He came over here early on in the 50s and wrestled. But Kenji Shibuya, who wrestled here longer as a Japanese wrestler, he was really from Hawaii. And, back in the 50s and 60s, we had a lot of Japanese Hawaiian people, wrestlers around. So they weren't really full-blooded Japanese wrestlers, but they also had a tremendous run as a tag team and with other partners. Now I'll take a break for a second. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
Stanley Blackburn,
What about him?
is he real?
Wait. First you don't believe wrestling's real. Now you want to know if Stanley Blackburn is real.
I've never, all the years I watched wrestling, I never saw Stanley Black. Heard him of.
Yes, Virginia, there is a Stanley Blackburn. Yes, Stanley Blackburn was a real deal. He did appear from time to time on TV. For those of you that don't know, Stanley Blackburn was the figurehead president of the American Wrestling Association. So supposedly he was the man in the high tower down in Amarillo, Texas. That's where his offices were allegedly to be. And he was the one that put out the edicts for, because Bobby Heenan, you've interfered in all these matches, you are now suspended indefinitely. And then, of course, Heenan would have a fit and, they're building towards something down the road. But he would appear from time to time for important title matches on TV. But he really was just a figurehead. He was not a president of anything other than his law firm in Amarillo, Texas. He was an attorney, and he was a friend of Vern Gagne's. And so Vern, doing his friend Stanley a favor, bringing him in as this figurehead president. But yes, there was a Stanley Blackburn. And he was the president up until about 1987. And then Stanley stepped down, and Joe Blanchard, former wrestler, was president for a while. Another figurehead title. Way in the back.
So all of this is a little before my time. Was every match televised, or was it maybe like there's a schedule and you could see it live and it wasn't on TV, or how did it all function?
Good question. Very good question. Back in the, let's go before 1984. Okay. In 1984, in the years before that, from World War II to 1984, so the end of World War II, 1946 through 84, around the United States, just the United States, there were at any given time 25 to 30 different individual wrestling territories. The AWA was a territory, and they had various towns, cities, or states that they wrestled in. But there were 30 of them, some of them smaller independents. There were, at one time, one organization from 48 to 1960. There was one organization, the National Wrestling Alliance, which was the biggest. And then in 60, Vern Gagne started the American Wrestling Association. And then in 63, some guy named Vince McMahon out in, New York, I guess, he started the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. This was Vince Sr., daddy to the current guy out there. So there were three major organizations. But to answer your question, wrestling was run in those days because of all of these various territories. And remember I said earlier that wrestling ran 300, 350 times a year? If you would have been able to get into your car in the 50s, the 60s, or the 70s, and you just wanted to take a year-long trip and just travel from town to town to town to town, you would be able to see a wrestling card every single night of the week. Guaranteed, wherever you were. That's how big it was. And with that, I will add this. In that era, there were anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 professional wrestlers doing that jaunt, making money. I'm not talking about the guys that were just in the undercard and they did it part-time or they didn't, make a lot of money. I'm talking about 3,000 guys that were the Vern Gagnes and the Pat O'Connors and the Carpentiers and the Luthesses and name after name. And every territory could bring these guys in. They had their mainstays, so you could see wrestling any night of the week. So to answer your question, the way they used to promote it was in order for a promoter in any town, even if it was some little small farm town, they needed to have a television outlet. And before I say any further about television, let's just back up to the end of the 40s when television was coming into vogue. It was a brand new medium, brand new because you had this little tiny 10-inch TV rabbit ears, fuzzy picture, got to move the rabbit ears to get the picture right. The channel doesn't come in right. You only had 2, 3, maybe 4 channels in your area. In order for a promoter to succeed in that era, they needed television, because television would get the word out. They'd have their local announcer, their local wrestlers, and they would put matches on, which in the day on TV, they were called squash matches. Now what that was is Eddie Sharkey on this card. Eddie was a guy who didn't make a lot of money in the business. He was respected, he was a good wrestler, but he was a lower tier wrestler. And so they might put one of the bad guys on the TV card against an Eddie Sharkey, or you all heard of Kenny J or George Gadasky. Well, these were squash guys. They put the main guy in against one of these guys. The realism wasn't that Kenny J was going to win, but you always cheered for it. You know, you wanted him to one time miss that boot to the face. So the promoter would put the squash match on. But the key thing to draw the fans in those days was that after their match on television, and wrestling in the era used to run maybe an hour, hour and a half. And so after their match, the wrestler would be interviewed by the local announcer. And they would be telling the fans, they had about 2 to 3 minutes, the wrestler did, to either get the fans to hate them by what they were saying or what they had just done in the ring, or to get them to love them or love them more and want to come to the arena to see them battle. So when you use 2 guys like Vern Gagne and Mad Dog Vachon, who were mortal enemies for a number of years, Vern would wrestle a squash guy, and Vern was a lot of times off and on the champion. So Marty O'Neill would call Vern Gagne into the ring. Fans, we're going to have the heavyweight king come out here right now and tell us about his match coming up with Mad Dog Vachon in 2 weeks. Vern, I know you want to get revenge. Last time out, you took the foreign object, and we don't know what it was. Vern, very calm, collected, very calm. He says, well, you know, Marty, I don't know what the dog hit me with, but I never went down like that before. And I am going to get even with him. I'm going to prove that wrestling is better than his brawling tactics. And he's not going to take my title. Well, there you have it, fans. The champion of the world, Vern Gagne. Well, then a few minutes later on the same wrestling card for TV, Mad Dog Vachon, he's in there growling, snarling, biting, kicking, spitting. And he's beating up some poor guy. You know, the guy didn't have a chance. I mean, better off just calling in sick. Mad Dog stomps him, kicks him, beats him. He comes out, and Marty's talking to him, and the dog, you know, and the dog and his dog, and I can't do the dog's voice, but you know, he said, you know, back in Algeria, I fought my way through the gutters and had to eat out of the garbage cans. I don't have the fancy rings that Vern Gagne does, and I'm going to beat him. And they got this feud. But you hate the dog so much, and you hate what he did to Vern Gagne. You don't want him to take the title back to Algeria. So the fans are going to come. So to answer your question, that's the way they did it in the old days. They would have an hour, hour and a half program, and it was all to sell the arena program. And the various wrestlers on the card would have their 2 to 3 minute interviews. And then you, as Marty used to say at the end of every wrestling program on Saturday nights, they used to start the cards at 9 o'clock. You know, by today's standards, that might be a little bit late. I don't know. But 9 o'clock start for the St. Paul Minneapolis Auditorium. And All-Star Wrestling would start at 6, live and pre-recorded from the Calhoun Beach Hotel, Channel 11, and they would go till 7:30. And at 7:30, when the show is winding up, they've obviously given you something within that last interview or match to really get you. They pulled you in. And then Marty would close the program with fans, run, don't walk to get your tickets. Now, this is a true fact. Between 7:30 and 9 o'clock, and I was telling Emily earlier tonight that wrestling was notorious for not starting on time. They said 9 o'clock, it was 9:20, 9:30 before the first match started. But you were wrestling fans, you were okay with it, you know what the heck. You didn't want to miss seeing somebody. Well, anyway, between 7:30 and 9 o'clock on the night of a wrestling card on Saturday nights, which is what St. Paul, Minneapolis ran for years, they would have a huge walk-up at the ticket box office. And I'm not exaggerating on that. Many times what just happened on TV and maybe the week before that, they would have fans, literally another 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 fans. This card right here, no, wrong one. This one here, January 30th of 1965, there was a snowstorm going on. They were at the Minneapolis Auditorium. There was literally, you know how St. Paul, Minneapolis are when you get a snowstorm and it's literally, you don't want to travel to go get milk or anything. Well, there was a snowstorm and the gate had been mediocre, but with the buildup they had for that main event, Crusher and Bruiser versus Hennig and Race, and then the ending of the program with Crusher and the Bruiser really selling what they were going to do to the Dolly sisters, Gertrude and Sylvia, as the Crusher called them. And then Hennig and Race claiming that they're going to put these two beer drinking goons out to pasture. You know, they had that night. Now the Minneapolis Auditorium, you got to remember they're not like our huge 60,000 arenas that we have today. The old Minneapolis Auditorium at capacity crowd with the ring in the center and seat set up would hold about 10 to 11,000 people on a sellout. So if they had a sellout of 10,000, I mean, that was huge. Well, that particular night, they sold out for that match. And I'm telling you, the weather was awful. I heard about it from my dad for a long time. So we risked our lives. But Dad, it was so cool, you know. And so the walk up, and did that answer your question? I'll always, anytime you ask me a question, I'm going to go around here and come back and I'll get to this. Yeah. And today's wrestling, just so you know, it is a lot different. They show high profile matches on TV on a regular basis because they're selling pay-per-view events. They don't, the arena shows are no longer. I mean, once or twice a year, your WWE might come to town. And then you're getting basically, when they do come to town, to usually it's the Target Center. And usually it's a generic card, but with all of their stars on the roster. And they'll draw it all with today's fan base. And today's product is fine, everyone. Seriously. It's just not for me. You know, I'm beyond that era. So yes,
I have a question. Could you talk a little bit about like Igor, excuse me, and Pampero Firpo? They didn't seem like they hung around long. I remember, you know, Igor seeing him at a grocery store getting a brick broke over his head and his stomach and stuff. But and Pampero Firpo, they didn't seem like they were around very long. And for that matter, Dick the Bruiser would only come in occasionally.
Okay, now you remember I told you a little bit ago that show this again here. You look at the top row, and I know it's hard for you folks in the cheap seats to see. You got the Crusher, Vern Gagne, Mad Dog Nick, Hennig, Dr. X, Bill Watts, Lanza Heenan. Next row, you've got Rashke, Billy Robinson, and Harley Woods. After that, each wrestler, and your buddy Firpo, right there, and Igor, right here, okay? Those top wrestlers that I mentioned, remember I talked about Mainstays? And if you went anywhere around the country, if you were one of those lucky people that could hop in your car and travel all over and see your card every night, like I said, would be so much fun. I told my wife many years ago, I always wanted to do that when I retired. And Vince McMahon took that dream away when he killed all the territories. So see why I hate the guy? But anyway, each territory had their mainstays. So if you were here, you had the Crusher and the Dog and Vern and so on. And if you went down to Florida, they had their mainstays. They had Eddie Graham and Boris Malenko and Hans Mortier and Bob Orton and so on. And those were the guys that were the mainstays. And most of the guys would be worked around those programs. So when wrestlers would come in, and I think I mentioned it earlier, that normally they would come into a territory. These guys were all independent contractors that were going around. So they might call up Vern, or Vern might call up them and say, can you come and you want to come into the, got something we can do with you? Can I come in? I'm going to be there. And they work out for 6 months, a year, 2 years was kind of the max for most guys. So during the course of that, and we'll just use 2 years. During the course of that 2 years, the wrestler would come from the introduction standpoint, letting fans know who he is. And if he's going to be a babyface, they're going to give him a huge push. And whatever storyline they build around him to make him popular. And then over the course of the 2 years, he's going to elevate up the cards and take on all the bad guys, get into a program with someone. I'm going to throw out the name Paul Diamond. Anybody remember Paul Diamond? And he's on the poster. Paul Diamond came here in 1970. And shortly before that, or shortly right after that, another guy came here by the name of Nick Bockwinkel. Okay? So Paul Diamond is in here, and he's a good-looking, I guess, to the women, he was extremely good-looking. That was the whole thing. Boy, where do I have Paul Diamond? Paul Diamond. Right there. He was about 6'4", from Miami, Florida. Wrestling fans, Paul Diamond. Now, Paul Diamond had been a wrestler for a lot of years and in a lot of territory. So he comes into Vern, and being a babyface, they're going to put him into some programs and use him well. And, you know, the promoters were always conscious of the fact that they tried to draw each segment of the audience. They wanted to have wrestlers that the kids would, maybe the younger kids would relate to. They wanted to have the bullies that you hated, and you hated them so much you paid money to see them. I mean, there's some good rationale there, right? And then you have, you know, the good guys. So Paul Diamond comes in, and he was here about 4 months, kind of going up the ranks. And one night on All-Star Wrestling, and this is when it goes back to the gentleman in the back when he asked about TV. On this particular night, Paul Diamond came into the ring. Marty O'Neill came into the ring. And Marty says, fans, tonight we have a surprise. We have a special presentation. Paul Diamond, a lady friend, a lady fan, made this beautiful ring jacket for him. And they take it out of the box, and Diamond, he loves the jacket, this lady fan. And they're cheering him away. I can't believe that Nick Bockwinkel came out and was jealous and ripped up the jacket. Well, anyway, he kind of got into it with Paul Diamond on TV. Well, what they were doing here is this was all a gimmick. There was no old lady that made Paul Diamond a jacket. This was, we're going to do this because it's going to get some heat for you. You're going to become more popular. Nick Bockwinkel's going to become more evil. And then, because he got injured from Nick beating on him in the ring and ripping up his jacket, now Paul's got to get revenge for that poor old lady. I will avenge this. And he comes out the following week and he's on crutches. And Nick Bockwinkel comes out and calls him the human zircon. I don't know what a zircon was, but that's what Paul Diamond was. And he goes, the guy can't even stand up, and he kicks the crutches out from under him. Paul goes down. Well, this was on TV. Well, there's your upcoming program. Paul's got to get revenge. As soon as I get healed, Marty, there's no way that Nick Bockwinkel is going to walk away from this. So Paul had these programs. And then after he was done with Nick, he went on, he had a program with Jack Lanza, Black Jack Lanza, and Bobby Heenan, his manager. And he was in some tag team matches. He was even Vern Gagne's tag team partner. Vern Gagne was having trouble with Dr. X. Oh boy. Dr. X trying to take Vern's title. And wouldn't you know that it wasn't bad enough that he had Dr. X. All of a sudden, the doc found a super secret mystery look-alike partner, Double X. They were from parts unknown. Yeah, it was a highly populated city for mass wrestlers. So Double X and Dr. X, and Doc had been feuding with Vern over the title, Vern is champ. And Double X got into the action, so now Vern has to get a partner. I mean, I can't be double teamed by these guys. Well, it was logical at the time. Who does he pick? Well, Marty, I have a partner, and I got a guy who is as good as me, as far as I'm concerned. And Paul, come on out here, Paul Diamond. And there they are. So May of 1970, here we have Vern Gagne and Paul Diamond take on the X-Men, it says on the program. And that was, so did that answer your question why some weren't here? No, Igor and Furpo. See, I don't forget. Igor was here, I originally mentioned in 1964 when he came out, and that was October of 64. He was here until 1968, believe it or not. Pretty much a regular. He left a little bit in 67, but he was right back. So he was here for 4 years. And then he went out, he was in Detroit. He was former Mr. Michigan, you may remember I said Dick Garza was. And he was very popular in the Michigan Territory, which was a territory, and Ohio and different cities out there. I can't keep track of all of them. Where was I? Igor. So Igor's out there. And then he comes back again in 1974. No, 69. Igor was back again in 69. He was gone for about a year and he came back. So he was here quite a bit, very popular. Now, using Furpo, here's an interesting story. Wrestling fans have short memories. You know, after you leave here tonight, you probably will not remember what I look like. I could come back next week and you won't remember that you saw me here. I'm teasing. But in wrestling, somehow they were able to pull this off. In 1958, this was pre-AWA, but it was still Minneapolis, and Vern Gagne was the guy behind the scenes. And there was a wrestler from Argentina that came in named Ivan the Terrible. Bushy hair, long beard. And he wrestled here for quite a few months. Had some main events, even wrestled against Vern. And in one match, Furpo was teamed with Joe Pazendak, who we talked about earlier. Joe Pazendak, by the way, trained Vern Gagne for the pro ranks. Was one of his trainers. Another guy was George Gordienko. I know you guys know that. Well, look at me. But anyway, and Joe Pazendak also helped to train, along with Vern Gagne, training him, Larry Hennig. Okay? So anyway, Furpo was here as Ivan the Terrible. Well, then he left. And in 1964, fans introducing from the Pampas, Argentina, the wild bull of the Pampas, Pampero Furpo.
I thought he was the madman of the Pampas.
It was the wild man.
Wild man
of the Pampas. And it was Pampero Furpo, but nobody, and they never said anything that he had been here previously as Ivan the Terrible.
What was his name? Was it Pampero?
Juan, I always have trouble with his last name. You know the Kardashians? You guys are familiar with those people. There's 100 of them. His name is close to, actually I can't pronounce it, Cashmania. That's his real name, Juan Cashmania. And I want to tell you, if you ever remember Pampero Furpo on his interviews, he was a heel beyond heels. He would bite, he would kick, he would gouge, and he had a big program. When I say program, it's a series of matches against two wrestlers. He had a big program with the Crusher, of course. The Crusher is a bad guy. Crusher used to call him Fuzzy. And the Crusher, because he had this, you know, the Furpo had this big head of hair and the beard. It's combed back a little bit there on that picture. But Furpo would come out, he'd have all this long hair. And the Crusher would claim that, you know, he had bugs in his hair and that fuzzy. And Crusher would come out with spray gun. He'd spray his hair, and to get the insects out of him and stuff. And the fans, they buy the antics, and of course they're going to buy a ticket because who can get rid of Furpo Crusher? Well, Furpo, and you remember his tagline. He would always come out on his interviews, and in his own way. And again, I'm not Rich Little or anything, so I can't do impersonations. But he'd come out and Marty would end his interview, and Furpo would go, "It is I. It is me. It is Pampero Furpo. Oh yeah!" And he'd walk off. And so, real life story. He spoke 7 languages. He was a very intelligent man. And I do want to just move ahead once. I had the opportunity to meet Furpo personally back in the late 1999, 2000, and 2001. I had a chance to see him for 3 years. He was attending a wrestling function that I would go to, and sitting at the table with no fuzzy hair, no beard, one of the quietest. And if you get up to him and have a conversation, Furpo, excuse me, I didn't hear you. Very, very calm and collected, very nice guy. And he was always so grateful that people remembered him when he did the Furpo thing. Well, long story short, when you talk about he wasn't here for a long time. So Furpo, see how I do that? Furpo was here from 64 to 66. And he went through the gamut of guys. He'd injured a few guys. He had this battle with the Crusher. And finally, Stanley Blackburn said, "We've had enough of this guy. He has injured more wrestlers. He has put people out of action. And we are suspending him for 3 years." Now, even as a kid in 1966, when I would have been 15, see, you can figure out how old I am. I realized that was kind of odd that they gave a specific time frame, 3 years, because normally it was just you're suspended indefinitely. Well, Furpo was gone for 3 years, and he was. He was not on the AWA cards. The first couple of months after they left, they would make reference to the fact that, Furpo is suspended, and fans, we don't know what has happened to him, but, well, lo and behold, 3 years later, strangely enough, this has always surprised me for pro wrestling, because they have no sense of their own history or dates or anything. 1969, guess who's back in the AWA? Pampero Furpo. And he's still mean, he's still rough, and he wants revenge because the Crusher cost him 3 years of work. And I've been down in Argentina and I've been waiting for the date. Now, truth be told, just to back up a second, during that 3 years, Furpo was wrestling for the Florida and the Georgia promotions. So he was fluently employed and making a lot of money down there. And he was very good down there. But now he's up here. And he wants revenge to the Crusher. Well, they've already got a ready-made feud. And this was one of the few times when they wanted fans to remember that feud from 3 years ago. Normally, they want you to forget when the guy's gone. So Furpo's back to get revenge. Well, the magic is how are we going to get Furpo and the Crusher into a match would be the immediate question. Because there were some fans that didn't remember any of this, became new fans. So the Crusher was involved in a program with that guy, Dr. X, we were talking about. And who comes to ringside to help out Dr. X? Furpo. He's in the ringside corner. Now, fans, this can't be good. I don't know what Furpo's doing here. It appears he's helping Dr. X. And during the course of the match, the Doc has got the Crusher on the ring ropes, and Furpo is going to land a good one on the Crusher. Well, the Crusher gets out of the way. He hit the Doc by mistake. Knocked him out, supposedly. And the Crusher put his foot on him. 1, 2, 3. How about that? Well, now Dr. X is ticked. What is Furpo doing in my business? I want him. So they played it that way. So we had to have a revenge match where the Doc and Furpo, and of course the fans, they're still kind of iffy, Furpo, a good guy against Dr. X, which one to, kind of like that Japanese Russian thing, which one are we going to cheer for? Do we hate them both? Cheer, boo them both, Well, during the course of that match, Furpo did win, I think if I remember right, by disqualification or something. And then the Crusher, or get the Crusher back in the picture. The Crusher was still having trouble now in 1969. This is before he and Bruiser lost the title, or were going to lose the title to the Vachons. Crusher says, I'm not bringing the Bruiser in. Furpo, or the Vachons, I'm going to finish it myself. I don't need a partner. Marty, or Wally Carbo comes out. He says, Crusher, you got to have a partner. It's a tag team match. All right, I'll get a partner. So the next week, Crusher, who is your partner going to be? Crusher wouldn't tell. So we get to the second week, and Crusher is out there with Marty O'Neill, and there's a stool like this. There's this big tarp over the stool. And the Crusher says, you want to know who my partner is? He pulls the button. Oh, yeah. Now, here's the beauty of this type of an arrangement. Everybody knew that Furpo wanted to get at the Crusher. That was the reason he came back, right? Well, what happens is, now the fans are saying, this isn't good. Can we trust Furpo with Crusher? Now Crusher's in the ring with the Butcher, the Mad Dog, and Furpo. This isn't good. Well, it turned out that Furpo was the perfect partner, and they got justice over the Vachons, and the Furpo became a good guy. There was a thing going on in 1969 and 70. I don't know if any of you remember it, but there was a thing called hippies. And it was weird. True story, at the local colleges, Hamlin and University in St. Paul being one of them, Furpo actually became a cult hero to a lot of the kids at the college. And they liked him, and he became kind of a fan favorite, so he was good. And I think maybe I mentioned this last time, so this will be the only thing that was the same as last time for those of you that decided not to come last time. Crusher was going to get even with the Vachons, and at the time, there was a show on television called Laugh-In, and they had Sammy Davis Jr. that would do the here come the judge routine. If you remember that, it might be in reruns. Well, wouldn't you know, the Crusher, to get on the bandwagon, he started wearing a judge's robe, and he didn't have a gavel, he had a sledgehammer. But he says, that's why I deliver sledgehammer justice, Marty. So then he became Judge Crusher for a moment, and that's when Furpo was here. Well, Furpo was here for about another year, and then he left and he was out on the West Coast. He was on the East Coast. He was in Detroit a lot, worked for that Territorial a lot, kind of settled down there. He was down south, so he had his time here. And then he came back in 1975. And there was a guy in 1975 named Baron von Raschke, who was a hated German heel. And Furpo was going to show him that his El Garfio was tougher. And so they had a feud. And Furpo was here for a while, had some tag team matches. He was here about a year, and then he was gone again. And that was his last time here. So to answer your question, Igor and Furpo were actually here longer than you may remember. Sure. But a lot of guys, 1.5 to 2 years. And a lot of times they would just disappear. You never hear from them again. And they weren't going to talk about it because they weren't here. They weren't coming back. Okay. Any other questions? Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, unless you want your wife to talk.
Battle royals. They had the big $10,000 purse. If this was predetermined, did the winner really get the purse or no?
What are you insinuating? Battle royals. Generally speaking, most promotions would maybe on a once-a-year basis hold a big battle royal, and they would have some humongous prize. I've got programs from the 50s and the 60s that say, $5,000 prize, and then there were $10,000 prizes, and then there were $20,000 prizes as the years went on. We got into the 80s, and there was a $100,000 prize. To answer your question, no, they didn't really have those prizes on there, but the wrestlers were being paid adequately and drawing the fans in. And the general idea of a battle royal was Andre the Giant, who I mentioned earlier, was kind of a traveling wrestler, and they would bring him in for a battle royal season. And you know, you put 15 or 20 guys in a battle royal. The idea behind the battle royal was usually one, to win the prize money, and two, you might be promised a chance at the world champion, so you get a title shot out of it. So they were all fighting for this chance at the title. And then you got the giant in there, you know, my word, who's going to throw him over the top ropes, you know? So battle royals were fun because you had strange alliances in them. Sometimes you'd see two bad guys, or a good guy and a bad guy, working together for a moment to throw somebody over. And the concept of the battle royal was you had to throw your opponent over the top rope. You had to hit, his feet had to hit the floor. If he hit the ring apron, he could get back in. And the idea was, it was kind of like a kid, when you were a kid, you played King of the Hill. And that's what a battle royal was, the last man standing. He was the one that got the, but usually they had very creative endings. And typically Andre didn't win, but he was a good draw. And they'd have, you know, 4 or 5 of the wrestlers gang up on him and lift him over and get him out. And then, of course, on the next card, Andre could have a revenge match against 2 guys or 1 guy. That's how it worked. And the other thing about battle royals is sometimes they had creative endings. One that comes to mind was 1969. Cowboy Bill Watts was in the Territory, very popular wrestler. In fact, I'm going to tell you, he was more popular at one point than the Crusher during a legit popularity poll that was done. But he wanted a shot at Vern Gagne. That was the whole objective. And he was a good guy. And the storyline for a year was, fans, is Vern Gagne afraid of Cowboy Bill Watts? Could he beat Cowboy Bill Watts? 6'4", 295 pounds out of Oklahoma. You know, can Vern beat Cowboy Bill Watts? And Bill Watts just wanted a chance. Then Vern and Bill would team up for some matches. And they'd have the storyline. Is Vern keeping him close to him so he doesn't have to face him? You know, they always had this in the background so fans could, you know, get a grip. Well, in one of the battle royals, we had Pepe Gomez, Mad Dog Deshaun, Butcher Deshaun, Man Mountain Mike was another attraction wrestler, 600 pounds supposedly. Cowboy Bill Watts was in it. Anyway, there were 15 guys that were in the battle royal. Well, about the third man out of the ring, 2 guys bashed Bill Watts' head into the ring post, and he fell out onto the ring apron, right by the corner of the ring. And he literally was laying there like most of the match. Well, it goes into the match, it's got the last 2 guys in the ring. And then all of a sudden, miraculously, through the will of God, Bill Watts is climbing up on the ropes and he comes into the ring, you know, and he'd been bloody, and he'd been laying there. And it was Lanza and Larry Henry. And they come charging at him. And Bill Watts ducked, and they both went over the top rope. And Bill Watts, your winner, fans, Cowboy Bill Watts. But it was a creative ending. Well, now Vern Gagne can't dodge it. So then they did have a series of matches over the course of the next year. And very good matches, by the way. So that's what a battle royal is for. Somebody over here had their guess.
Earlier, you mentioned 1984 in the weekly TV tapings at the Calhoun Beach Club. Where did they film the weekly shows after 84 up until the promotion folded? And then also right now, who's the overseer of all those old tapings? I'm talking the house shows now, not the old Civic Center matches.
Well, first of all, let's touch the first question first. Originally, if you look back at the, I think it's, well, in fact, I don't have to think. It's in my book, Minnesota's Golden Age. I talk about how wrestling was on television. And back in the, you got to turn around, there it is. Back in the beginning, wrestling was actually on, All-Star Wrestling in the Twin Cities was actually on all 4 at different times, different eras, all 4 channels that we have in the Twin Cities, which many fans didn't know. In the early 50s, it was on WTCN. Now I want you to follow this. It was on WTCN which was channel 4 on your dial in the Twin Cities. And channel 4, WTCN, then became WCCO in 1954, I believe the year, correct? And surprisingly, WTCN kept the call letters and went down the dial to channel 11 and became, again, WTCN. Stood for the radio guys out there, the W's and the K's in radios and TV, it had to do with the Mississippi River. One side, east, west, K's and W's. So W, that's logical. TCN stood for Twin Cities Network originally. So it was on channel 11, but then it was on channel 9 for a while, KMSP. And they used to tape them at the Calhoun Beach, and they were actually being broadcast over channel 9 at some point in time. KSTP, they had them for a while. But to answer your question, the matches at the Calhoun Beach Club in Minneapolis, that's where the Channel 11 WTCN studios were in the 60s. And the way the program would start, they would always tell you at the beginning with the All-Star Wrestling theme song playing, which if you ever want to look it up and hear it, that song, it's called the Golden Gate March. And it's out there on YouTube. But the wrestling, they'd say live and pre-recorded from the Calhoun Beach Studios in downtown Minneapolis, All-Star Wrestling. Now to the ring, and Marty O'Neill. So they would tape them there. Channel 11, WTCN, then in the 80s, I want to say 85, 86, or 87, those dates are a little fuzzy for me, but they became known as WUSA. They changed their call letters. And then almost quickly, like a coffee break, they were no longer WUSA and they became CARE, K-A-R-E, which they are to this very day. But in 1972, 3, right in that range, they moved from the Calhoun Beach Club, the studio, WTCN, they moved the offices for wrestling out to the Shillard Towers in St. Louis Park. That's where the wrestling office went. And they were sometimes taping at the Channel 9 studios. So at different times it varied. Okay, now in answer to your question, you asked me about the tapes or who has them or whatever. Here's a sad thing. All of the TV footage for the 60s, well, anything from the 50s, the 60s, and to about very early 70s, all of the TV footage, but the rarest exception. For example, like that Crusher Mad Dog thing I asked you to look up, told you to look up on YouTube. It's non-existent. It's gone. And what happened is that in the old days of the TV studio, when they were going live every day, every Saturday night with the program, the promoters of that era, and this was all over the country, this isn't just Vern's AWA, the promoters of that era didn't have the foresight or the vision to say, or to know that maybe this stuff could be valuable someday. They were only in the moment. And they used these big reel-to-reel tapes, and they would tape over them. So last week's got taped over for tonight, and they told to keep what they needed to show as a highlight, maybe 3 or 4 times during the course of a feud or something. So ironically, all that stuff is gone. From the mid-70s on, there is footage that's out there, but it's usually not on a professional basis. And anything from the TV studios or anything after that, that guy from out east again, Vince McMahon, got it all. He bought it pennies on the dollar from Vern Gagne. And he has it all. He also has all of the tapes, anything that exists from every other territory. He literally bought everybody up. He's got a library. There's a lot of stuff he has. But, and I think you can subscribe to his network or something and get it. I don't know. I've seen it all. I don't care to give him any money. That's me personally. I mean, I'd rather put my $20 under the table and let someone find it than give it to him. Want to hear how I really feel? No. But anyway, so the tapings are gone. It's sad. Any more questions? Wait a minute. We gotta, I lied to you earlier. I told you that I wasn't gonna give another commercial, but I got it to this one.
Cheers, Steve.
Fans, remember, there's none genuine without Vern Gagne's picture and signature on the label. There is a genuine bottle of Vern Gagne's Jersey with his picture and signature. The only thing I wouldn't want you to do is I don't think it would be good to take.
What was that stuff?
Well, I don't know, but George Schire and Gdansky said one time that he fed it to his cat, and he said his cat had the shits for 2 weeks. I quote him on that, so I'm not sure. Okay, that was the scrap iron. None genuine without Vern Gagne's picture signature on it. Okay, I want to finish up. My friend Brent back there is going to be waving the flag here pretty soon and tossing us out if I don't wind it up. I want to share something with you that you notice I put up here, do not touch. And honestly, if you do touch them, I swear you're going to explain to your friends and family why you no longer have hands. But I want to show them to you. One of the things that was really cool about wrestling is there's a age-old great story. In 1975, in July, in Davenport, Iowa, Vern Gagne was defending his title, championship title, in a match down there. And you remember I told you earlier, I always get back to this stuff. They used to have the ringside tables close to the ring. And Vern had his title belt after he took it off at the introduction, and he handed it to the referee, who in turn handed it to the timekeeper, who in turn put it on the table. Well, true story, some fan in the audience had the kudos to run up to the table, grab the belt, head to the exit sign out of the building, and he was gone. And Vern's belt was stolen. Now, this belt was it was originally given to Vern in 1952 from there was a magazine called Police Gazette back then, and it was a police type magazine. They presented Vern with this belt, and it had some nice jewels on it. It was a legit, perfect belt. And this fan ran off with it. It hit the newspapers. I have newspaper clippings from Davenport, and they never caught the guy. The guy obviously, though, wasn't too bright. He did take the diamonds out. They found the belt, and it was in a garbage can. So whoever the person was that took it, he had the jewels. At the time in 1975, and again, I tell you to use inflation figure in here. At the time, the belt was allegedly valued at $10,000. Okay, and so Vern got the belt back, but it was a mess. Well, this was in July of 75. In November of 75, Vern was preparing to give up his title for a while. And he was going to give it to his heir apparent, the man who he had promised it to in 1970 behind the scenes. When Nick Bockwinkel came to the AWA, that was the reason he came. Vern said, I want you to be my champ. And eventually we're going to put it on. So they were good friends outside the ring. Vern put the title on him, and this is the night right here, November 8th, 1975, St. Paul Auditorium, Nick Bockwinkel versus Vern Gagne. And unfortunately that night, Vern, and those other title defenses as well up to that point, he came to the ring and he had no title belt. And so Nick won the title that night from Vern, and Nick had no title belt. And this went on for about 4 or 5 months. Nick didn't have a title belt. Well, Vern Gagne was in the process of having a new belt made. And he went to the Denver, I'm not sure the exact name of it, but it was the Denver prison. And the inmates made a new title belt. Okay, so this one is what was the inmate belt. Okay, this was what was presented to Nick in December of '75. And other people have called it the license plate belt. License plate being the Denver type thing, but it's the inmate belt. I think you can understand why I wouldn't want you to touch this, okay? It does strap on, it's got hooks, everything. This is, of course, a replica. Now, I'm going to tell you why it's a replica. And it isn't the only replica out there, but this belt was destroyed. Vern didn't have good luck with belts. In 1985, Vern put his title on a guy named Stan Hansen. Stan Lariat Hansen. And strangely enough, in Denver one night, Stan Hansen had been wrestling regular in Japan, making a lot of money wrestling in Japan. And Vern had a deal worked out with Shohei Baba, who was the promoter over there and a wrestler himself in his day, that they could share Stan Hansen. And Vern put his belt on him, Stan wore that belt. And what happened was, though, is that Stan was over there a lot more than Vern wanted him to do. That's fact. And Vern couldn't get dates for him on his cards, and it was his champion. So there's two stories here. Stan was an employee of Vern Gagne when he worked for the AWA, and he was an employee of Shohei Baba when he was in Tokyo. Stan decided his allegiance was more to Baba, which was natural because he was making a lot of money with it. Well, on this night in Denver, Vern went to Nick Bockwinkel. In fact, Nick was going to wrestle Stan that night for the championship. That was their announced main event. And Nick was going to win the title that night. And the only problem is that nobody told Stan. Okay. Is that better? Be like the WWE. They don't wear them, they think they're their shoulder. So the night of the match, Vern calls Nick and Stan into the shower. Now, I say this because in the locker room days, generally speaking, when the promoter or a wrestler or two wrestlers were going to have a discussion about something, they would go into the shower. They're not in there getting wet. They're just talking over the match or what's going on. So Vern had called him into the shower and he told Stan, he said, Stan, I want you to drop the title to Nick tonight. This was news to Stan. This wasn't in the program. This wasn't in the, how long you're going to hold it there. And Stan says, the hell I am. He said, no, you're going to drop it. I'm not dropping the title. He says, I'm going over to Japan and I'm going to be over there for 8 weeks. I'm advertised as the AWA champion. I'm not losing the strap tonight. They called it the strap. Vern says, well, you are, and that's the way it is. And I won't repeat the word, but Stan told him to F off. And he took the belt, his duffel bag, he left the building. So now Vern, in 2 matches to go on his card, well, his main event just went to the toilet. And by default, he awarded the title to Nick Bockwinkel. But now here's the funny thing. Again, Nick didn't have a title belt. So 2, 3, 4 months go by. Vern is telling Stan, I want the belt back. It's my belt, it's not yours, which is true. It's his company property. Wherever you work, you can't take the desk home or whatever you have. And Stan wasn't responding. So Vern got an attorney, cease or desist, get this belt back to me. Finally, Stan, okay, he saw the error of his ways, stealing the belt. All right, fine, I'll send it back to him. Well, he did.
but he decided to run over it with his pickup truck before he put it in the mail. So Vern got the belt back, and there was this huge crease, and the belt was mangled. And Stan put a little note in there, you know, stick it up your, you can use your imagination. And that's how that went with that belt. So Vern, again, had to come up with some more belts. And off and on, came up with belts, but this was the one that he finally ended up with. And this one is similar in look to what his original Police Gazette belt was, with minus the usual jewel work and things. And Vern's original Gazette belt had this part here where he got a picture of whoever the champion was at the time. Vern in most cases, but Mad Dog when he held it. And so this was the belt that he ended up coming up with. And this kind of ended the AWA. Now there is another replica of this belt that is down at the Minnesota Historical Society, St. Paul History Center, downtown St. Paul. They're the ones that published my book, cheap one. And there is a belt, the last belt that's on display there. They got a little display about Vern Gagne and the rest of them. So if you ever get a chance, take a look at it. It's under a glass case. I told Greg, I said, if you decide you want to get rid of that belt like you've gotten rid of everything else, remember, I'll take care of it for you. I will. Any final questions? Yes.
During a match, there was a time when they switched sides and decided to move it over.
Say the question again about the promoter.
You got a guy who lose, I don't want to lose.
Oh, okay.
The other guy wants to win. Do they ever turn it?
Yeah. They, you know, wrestling. I'm not gonna color it as being always a upfront, clean, honest type. There were a lot of shenanigans that went on behind scenes, and there were wrestlers that sometimes just would do something against the promoter's wishes. In cases like that, if it was severe enough or it affected the storyline or the company bad enough, a lot of times they were gone. And as it was in that day, and there were so many territories, the guys didn't need to worry about it because there was always a place they could go. Unless there were certain promoters that hung out together and, you know, sort of blackballed him, so to speak. But generally speaking, you don't want me here? Screw you, I will work over there. And that's what they did. And that was the luxury of it. I say that because now today, let's just bring this full circle. Today's wrestling, very glitzy, very colorful, very well produced. Bright lights, the fireworks we talked about, the loud music. It's high profile. But here's the irony of it. Between WWE and AEW, one of the other major promotions, not on the level of WWE, but one of the players. And then whatever number of smaller independents that you want to have or look at. Today, there are only about 300 to 400 wrestlers that are actually making the big money. And if you're not working for WWE, and in some instances now AEW a little bit, you're just not going to make enough in a lot of cases to pay the bills. So that's what Vince McMahon took down when he invaded the territories in 1984 and started taking talent from all of them, creating his empire for pay-per-views, which was inevitable that it was going to happen. And as it turned out, it is what it is today, but we none of the wrestlers have a place to go anymore. Whereas that 3,000, 4,000 I said to you earlier, they could always make money, and they did if they wanted to do it full time. And it's getting to the 8 o'clock hour, because I'm a man of my word, I'm going to tell you this. You guys have been a blast. I love it. I hope if you haven't got the book, you'll take us up on it. It's a donation, folks, to the Heritage Center here for the fun things they do and the great work they do to keep history going and bring in speakers. So $25, give it to a friend, give it to a relative, put it in the bird cage. I don't care what you do with it, but it's a donation. And if you do that, that's great. And if you don't, that's fine too. We didn't bring you here to make you buy my book. That was just icing on the cake. So I thank you very much. And with that, it is 8 o'clock and I'm going to tell you this. That's all the people need to know.